And they were organized around those particular local markets. In my case, Los Angeles, Boston, Detroit, period. And so the leadership came from there. It was generally the most skilled of the craftsmen who led because of the skill of my hands and the ability to train people in our apprenticeship programs. The ultimate irony is that unions hit upon the success of its future 200 years ago. You are the keeper of skills, now education, training, and skills. For America and its organizations to survive, it will only be because of the skills, training, and things that we have. And I suggest that the union movement is still the place for it to reside, to continue to reside. You will be the trainer of first and last resort, period. You have 200 years of history of doing this. That's where it started. When I go into New York City and I look at the clothing industry, all those little places in New York City that used to make garments, the garment district, who in the hell did their industrial engineering? The union. Who set up their piecework systems? Not management, the union. Who determined the pay? The union. Who determined, in effect, what productivity was and to be able to compete? The unions. Management just managed how it happened each day. You have always been, you need to continue to be the educator of first choice and the educator of last resort. Period. And that's what we're supposed to be here about, is that. And your history tells me that. And if you think about it, we're fumbling around a bit trying to do that, but the core is built inside of you. Let's utilize it to success. And Rich and I talked about this. I'm a firm believer. Let's talk about the truth. First of all, I want to make an observation about crafts. The crafts that I'm going to be talking about here, the predominant ones that predominated in our continent, came from a European, Western European direction. But I want to recognize also that crafts came from south of the border all the way to the tip of South America, from the African continent, and from Asia. They are just now starting to come into play in certain areas. They are not, to my knowledge, they're not documented. Well, I run around and I first of all trying to figure out what crafts I was dealing with and the ones that I knew in my life, and coming from northern Michigan. But if you look into all of our cultures, there are crafts. And those crafts played an important part in where we're going. This just happened to be a past system that was so well documented and, if you will, documented in terms of how it fit in. But I do not want to ignore those other path systems. So for your boxes, is to go back and look at, from a Hispanic standpoint, from an Asian standpoint, what were the crafts? Where are they? What role do they play? I can't just concentrate in Africa. Where did they come from? They're there. If you come to our house, you'll find them laying all over the house. But I haven't quite figured out how I fit them all together yet. It's only when we take a composite picture of America. And it was kind of interesting when I was wandering through John Wayne Airport, or whatever that thing's called out there with the runway that's that long and the jet power that goes up like that. I got off the plane or it was in Sacramento, and I told Maureen, I said, God, this is and I looked down the aisle of all the people, and I said, God, this is a picture of the world. There it is. So some of us, you know, if you went to northern Michigan, you wouldn't see a picture of the world. You'd see a piece of the world. Detroit, you see a piece of the world, but unfortunately over there was a piece of the world. All the pictures, all the faces, all of the cultures. And so it's important that we recognize that. Now, the most controversial box that we have to deal with is the next information box. Each worker must command a certain range of knowledge of manual skills, common and traditional to the craft, passed down to the male members of the family, which also means that because of its nature of being from Western Europe, we're white. So if you went back to the guilds in Western Europe, they were white. They were European. That's where it started. But if you think about the other cultures that got here too and brought things with them, that hasn't been well documented. But it's here. When we present to people, we cannot ignore those. In each of our boxes, we have to figure out what are those that come from those cultures. Hope you'll share some of them with me when you go home and think a little bit about it as we try to do that. So that explains the family. Because what happened is when it left Europe, that piece that played a role in some of our unions, and when it left Europe, it left as the male members of a family. The grandfather passed it down to the father passed it down to the son. He certainly didn't pass it down to the daughter. And down and down and down and down and down. And it transmitted across the Atlantic, ended up in America. Now, that's why when we looked at the craft unions during the first part of the centuries, and I'm not talking about these crafts, but as it went into the building trades, the struggle ensued. How do we, in effect, have the building trades basically look like America, as America has developed? This is bound to prompt some questions and concerns and comments. That's fine. That's what we're all about. That's reality. We have to deal with it. And how we deal with it is to remember that there are other trails that got here too. What are they? Where did they come from? What did we bring? How did we add to this? You know, if I went to, in fact, it was just in the paper recently, to New Mexico. They did a lot on weaving. If you went to the upper northeastern section, because we made a trip through there and almost had a heart attack when we visited people. Now, these are people who are not Hispanic. They are Spanish. What's the distinction? Well, they made quite a distinction. But some of the great weavers up in that corner of the state came from the conquistadors that invaded through Mexico, and they came from Spain and Portugal and came up and around. And so weaving, the most beautiful, and now they just were, I think it was in the New York Times over the weekend, these gorgeous things. The one we saw was being made for a home. Somebody must have had a lot of money, because and this was 20 years ago, $100,000 for this carpet. And I said, God, we'd like to have one of those in our house, but you know, it's worth more than a house. And those are the things that I don't want us to ignore. Now, knowing all of that, and I'm going to come back because we're going to play the family role here in a minute. And the next thing we have to look at is bargaining strategy. What did these unions do to bargain? What was their power? Well, in my box I said regulate the supply of labor to meet but to not exceed the demand. That means that in my apprenticeship programs and things like that, I never created too many. I created scarcity. Now, for every time somebody, if you're in a craft and a skill and somebody criticizes for you to do that, I say, go talk to your local physician. What the hell do you think the doctors did? They created scarcity. What did the pharmacists do? Scarcity. What did the professions do? Cyclical. Over and over and over again, we repeat it. So scarcity was very, very important. Well, with that thought in mind, I'd like you to go over a page, and I'm going to pick on you. I have to change your heritage. I have to change your gender. And I'm going to make you all white males for this to work. So, Yvonne, yes. You are now a journeyman carpenter. Okay. Way, way back. Jose, you are a journeyman carpenter. But you're all in the same family.
Yes. Oh, we're all in the same family.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
You're the grandfather, he's the father. Jessica, you're an apprentice carpenter. You're one of the members of the family. They are training you. Michael, you're an apprentice carpenter. George, you're an apprentice carpenter. And least but not last, let's see. Ty, you're a trainee. You're all a member of the same family. You're all white. You're all related. Now, I have to lay a little bit of groundwork here. Ty has a drinking problem. It's really too bad, but he does. So some things that we have to take a look at is, okay, how in those days, we know what we do today, but how in those days did we control a power source to focus it for the good of people and increasing their wealth? The first thing that we had to do is we controlled entrance to the trade through apprenticeships. So that means then, as journeyman carpenters, you were the grandfather and the father, but you were the leaders of the union, and the union was made up of your family. And you determined who got further training. So in Ty's case, if we completed his training, he becomes excess labor. He may go beyond the point of scarcity. And what kind of holds me back a bit is he's got his drinking problem. And that's a concern because, Ty, if you don't kind of shape your social life up, we aren't going to give you a skill. And in the scheme of those years, that could be very serious. Now remember, we didn't have labor contracts, we didn't have fringe benefits, we took care of our own, including Ty, in the beginning. So we controlled entrance to the trade through the apprenticeship. And that meant that in effect, my journeyman carpenters determined what the market would bear. They did not, in effect, even get close to it. They shorted it a bit. Why? For leverage, power, period. We saw union hiring halls. Now, there's a lot of different definitions of union hiring halls, okay? And a union hiring hall is simply, if I am an owner of something, the only place I could go to get a carpenter was to come to see you guys, you two. And if you decided you'd send a carpenter, I got one. If you didn't, in Los Angeles, there's no other source for one. In Boston, there's no other source for one except through your local union. Your local union. Or here in Detroit through our local union. People didn't travel from Boston to Los Angeles to practice their carpentry. If you were born and raised there and you were part of that local union, that's where you were. I want you to think of those who are in local unions today, and go back to what Bill said a minute ago in terms of that little piece he put in his box. If you think about those threads, what threads exist? That's another thread that tells me that somewhere back in the historic past,